Forget the Hollywood image of a drunken Viking staggering through a smoky village, mead horn in one hand and blood-stained axe in the other. The truth is far darker and far stranger. What if I told you that for the Vikings, alcohol wasn't just about celebration, but about survival, politics, war, and even religion? This isn't the simple tale of rowdy warriors partying after raids. This is the unsettling reality of how alcohol shaped an entire civilization. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this right now? Are you lying in bed, maybe sipping something yourself? Walking, driving, just passing time? Drop a comment below, because by the end of this journey, you'll never look at alcohol or the Vikings the same way again. So get comfortable, maybe dim the lights and settle in. Because what you're about to hear will shatter everything you thought you knew about the Norse world. Their drinking culture wasn't reckless chaos, it was strategic, dangerous, and utterly essential to their survival. And the most shocking part, this story doesn't begin where you think it does. Here's something that will blow your mind. For Vikings, being sober could literally kill you. Not because of some cultural shame, not because of peer pressure, but because of something far more sinister and practical. In 9th century Scandinavia, clean drinking water was essentially a death sentence waiting to happen. Rivers, lakes, and wells were contaminated with bacteria, parasites, and diseases that could wipe out entire families in days. The Vikings knew this, even if they couldn't explain it in scientific terms. They observed, they learned, and they adapted in the most ingenious way possible. Their solution? Make everything alcoholic, and I mean everything. The daily Viking breakfast wasn't just bread and meat, it came with a side of ale. Not strong ale, mind you, but what historians now call small ale, a low-alcohol beer that was safer than water, but weak enough to function on. Adults drank it. Teenagers drank it. And here's where it gets really shocking. Children as young as 5 years old were given diluted ale as their primary beverage. Yes, you heard that right. Viking children were essentially on a constant, mild alcoholic buzz from the moment they could walk. Before you judge this as primitive or irresponsible, consider this. Those children survived. The ones who drank pure water often didn't. The brewing process itself was a closely guarded secret, passed down through generations of Viking women who understood chemistry better than most modern people realize. They used a combination of barley, hops when available, and various herbs that not only flavored the ale, but added medicinal properties. These weren't just drinks, they were liquid medicine cabinets. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. The Vikings didn't just stumble upon this solution, they perfected it through trial, error, and what can only be described as accidental genius. They discovered that the fermentation process killed harmful bacteria while preserving nutrients. They essentially created the world's first large-scale water purification system, and it ran on alcohol. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows massive brewing operations. We're talking about industrial-level production that could supply entire communities. Excavated longhouses reveal brewing equipment that rivals modern microbreweries in complexity and efficiency. These weren't primitive people making crude drinks. These were sophisticated engineers of intoxication. The most disturbing part? They had to drink to live, which meant an entire civilization was walking the fine line between functional sobriety and survival-necessary intoxication every single day. Imagine trying to navigate Viking politics, warfare, and daily life while maintaining just the right level of alcoholic consumption to stay alive, but functional. This constant state of mild intoxication may have actually contributed to their fearsome reputation in battle. When everyone you're fighting against is stone-cold sober and you've been on a mild alcoholic buzz since childhood, your pain tolerance, aggression levels, and fear responses are fundamentally different. But the Vikings' relationship with alcohol went far deeper than just survival. What they did with their stronger drinks reveals a culture that understood the psychological and spiritual power of altered states of consciousness in ways that would make modern psychologists envious. The real story of Viking drinking culture is just beginning to unfold. Everything you think you know about Viking mead is probably wrong. The romantic image of Norse warriors guzzling honey wine from ornate chalices while planning their next raid? Pure fantasy. The reality of mead in Viking culture is far more complex, far more exclusive, and reveals a shocking truth about social hierarchy that historians are still unraveling. First, let's destroy the biggest myth. Mead was not the everyday drink of choice for Vikings. In fact, for most Vikings, mead was so rare and expensive that they might taste it only a few times in their entire lives. Why? Because producing mead required honey, and honey in medieval Scandinavia was liquid gold. Think about it logically. Bees don't thrive in harsh Nordic climates. The short summers and brutal winters meant that honey production was limited, unpredictable, and incredibly valuable. A single pound of honey could be worth more than a Viking's monthly wages. Using it to make alcohol was the equivalent of burning money for warmth. So who was drinking mead? The jarls, the chieftains, the wealthy traders who could afford to import honey from warmer climates or maintain their own beehives as a luxury. Mead wasn't the drink of the common Viking warrior, it was the champagne of the medieval Norse world. But here's where archaeological discoveries are rewriting the history books. Recent excavations have uncovered something shocking. Vikings were masters of mead forgery. They created drinks that looked, smelled, and even tasted like mead, but contained little to no actual honey. How? Through a combination of fermented tree saps, concentrated fruit sugars, and herbs that mimicked honey's sweetness and color. They were essentially creating counterfeit luxury goods centuries before anyone thought to regulate such practices. These fake meads allowed lower-class Vikings to participate in ceremonies and rituals that required mead without bankrupting themselves. The most fascinating discovery comes from a 10th century Viking burial site in Denmark, where archaeologists found vessels containing residue from what they initially thought was high-quality mead. Chemical analysis revealed something extraordinary. The drink was a complex blend of fermented birch sap, apple concentrate, and meadowsweet herbs, with less than 5% actual honey content. This discovery suggests that the Vikings had developed an entire underground economy of mead substitutes, complete with quality grades and regional variations. Some of these substitute meads were apparently so well crafted that they fooled even experienced drinkers. But the real mead, the genuine article made with pure honey, held a special place in Viking culture that went beyond mere consumption. It was believed to be the drink of the gods themselves. According to Norse mythology, the mead of poetry was created from the blood of Kvasir, a being born from the saliva of all the gods. Anyone who drank this mythical mead would become a poet or scholar. This wasn't just storytelling, it was sophisticated marketing. By linking mead to divine inspiration and wisdom, Viking society created a justification for its extreme cost and rarity. If you could afford real mead, you weren't just wealthy, you were spiritually elevated closer to the gods themselves. The psychological effects of this belief system were profound. When a Viking chieftain served genuine mead at a feast, he wasn't just showing off his wealth, he was claiming divine authority. The guests weren't just getting drunk, they were participating in a sacred ritual that connected them to the gods. Modern analysis of genuine Viking mead recipes reveals another shocking truth. These drinks were often far more potent than anything we consume today. While modern mead typically ranges from 8–20% alcohol content, archaeological evidence suggests Viking mead could reach 25–30% alcohol content, making it closer to a liqueur than wine. The fermentation process was also radically different. Vikings would often age their mead for years in buried clay vessels, allowing wild yeasts and bacteria to create complex flavors and higher alcohol content. The result was a drink so powerful that even small quantities could produce profound intoxication. This brings us to a darker aspect of mead culture that historians are only now beginning to understand. High alcohol mead wasn't just consumed for pleasure, it was used as a tool of political manipulation and social control. But before we explore that sinister side of Viking drinking culture, we need to understand the most important and least understood aspect of their alcohol consumption: the sacred rituals that could determine the fate of entire kingdoms. What I'm about to reveal to you is one of the most powerful and least understood ceremonies in human history. The Sumbl wasn't just a drinking party, it was a sophisticated system of politics, magic, and social engineering that could topple kings and reshape entire societies. Most people have never heard of it, but its influence echoes through modern culture in ways that would shock you. Imagine a ceremony where every word spoken becomes a binding oath, where the order of toasts determines social hierarchy for the coming year, and where a single, misspoken phrase could trigger blood feuds that last for generations. This was Sumbl, and it was arguably more important to Viking society than their famous raids and battles. The rules of Sumbl were complex and absolutely sacred. The ceremony began at sunset and could last until dawn, with participants sitting in a precise circle that reflected their social status. The host would begin with the first toast, always to Odin, and then the sacred drinking horn would pass clockwise around the circle. Here's where it gets fascinating. You couldn't just drink and pass the horn. When it was your turn, you had to make a boast, a vow, or share crucial information with the group. These weren't casual comments. They were considered magically binding declarations that the gods themselves would witness and enforce. Archaeological evidence suggests that major political decisions were made during Sumbl ceremonies. Treaties were negotiated, marriages arranged, and military alliances forged, all while participants were increasingly intoxicated as the night wore on. The combination of alcohol, peer pressure, and sacred obligation created an environment where people revealed their true intentions and made commitments they might never have made while sober. But here's the most shocking part: women held extraordinary power in Sumbl ceremonies. While Viking women had limited formal political rights during Sumbl, they could challenge male authority, make binding political statements, and even override decisions made by chieftains and jarls. The role of the Lady of the Hall during Sumbl was particularly fascinating. She controlled the drinking horns movement, decided who spoke when, and could end careers with a single gesture. Historical accounts describe instances where women used Sumbl ceremonies to expose corrupt officials, challenge unjust laws, and even declare their intention to divorce their husbands. One of the most documented cases involves Gudrun Osvifsdottir, who used a Sumbl ceremony to publicly accuse her husband of cowardice and announce her intention to leave him for a more worthy warrior. Because her declaration was made during Sumbl, it was considered legally binding, and her husband could do nothing to stop her. The psychological manipulation involved in Sumbl was extraordinary. Experienced participants would strategically time their toasts to maximum effect, waiting until certain individuals were sufficiently intoxicated to pressure them into unfavorable agreements or embarrassing admissions. The most skilled Sumbl participants were essentially ancient political operatives, using alcohol, social pressure, and sacred tradition to advance their agendas. They understood that people's true intentions emerged under the influence of alcohol and divine obligation, and they exploited this knowledge ruthlessly. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed the sophisticated equipment used in Sumbl ceremonies. Excavated drinking horns show intricate carvings that weren't just decorative, they were mnemonic devices that helped participants remember the complex rules and social obligations associated with the ceremony. Some horns contained hidden compartments that allowed the host to control how much alcohol different participants received. This gave the ceremony leader the ability to keep crucial allies relatively sober while ensuring that potential enemies became increasingly intoxicated and prone to poor decisions. The most disturbing aspect of Sumbl was its use as a form of psychological warfare. Enemy chieftains would be invited to Sumbl ceremonies under the pretense of negotiating peace, only to be manipulated into making statements or commitments that would later be used against them. Historical records describe instances where entire wars were triggered by statements made during Sumbl ceremonies. A drunken boast about territorial claims, a carelessly spoken insult, or a poorly timed marriage proposal could escalate into conflicts that lasted for decades. The sacred nature of Sumbl meant that words spoken during the ceremony couldn't be taken back or explained away. If you declared your intention to raid a neighbor's territory while holding the sacred horn, you were bound by divine law to follow through, regardless of how drunk you were when you made the statement. This created a culture where political maneuvering required not just strategic thinking, but also exceptional alcohol tolerance and verbal discipline. The most successful Viking leaders were those who could navigate these alcohol-fueled political minefields while maintaining their composure and advancing their interests. But Sumbl was just one way that Vikings weaponized alcohol. The tactical use of drinking in warfare reveals a level of strategic thinking that military historians are only now beginning to appreciate. The Vikings didn't just drink before battle, they turned alcohol itself into one of the most devastating weapons in their arsenal. What I'm about to reveal shows a level of psychological warfare and strategic thinking that puts modern military tactics to shame. The concept of liquid warfare began with a simple observation. Drunk enemies make stupid decisions, but the Vikings took this basic principle and developed it into a sophisticated system of military strategy that relied on alcohol as much as swords and shields. And the most documented case of alcoholic warfare comes from the siege of Paris in 845 AD. Ragnar Lothbrok's forces didn't just attack the city walls, they first sent gifts of ale and wine to the defenders, ostensibly as peace offerings. The French soldiers, exhausted from weeks of siege preparation, gratefully accepted what they thought was a gesture of goodwill. What they didn't know was that the Vikings had deliberately contaminated some of these drinks with ergot, a fungus that grows on grain and produces hallucinations, confusion, and muscle spasms. While not all the defenders received the contaminated alcohol, enough did to create chaos within the city's defenses when the real attack began at dawn. Historical accounts describe French soldiers seeing phantom Viking armies, attacking their own comrades and abandoning their posts in terror. The psychological impact was devastating, and Paris fell within hours of the main assault. But this wasn't an isolated incident. Archaeological evidence from multiple Viking battlefields shows a consistent pattern. Containers that once held alcohol mixed with various psychoactive substances, suggesting this was a standard tactic rather than a one-time innovation. The Vikings' understanding of alcohol's effects on combat effectiveness was sophisticated. They knew that small amounts could reduce fear and increase aggression, while larger amounts would impair judgment and coordination. They used this knowledge both to enhance their own warriors' performance and to sabotage their enemies. The berserkers, those legendary Viking warriors who fought in a trance-like fury, may have relied more on strategic alcohol consumption than on pure battle rage. Recent analysis of skeletal remains from known berserker burial sites shows evidence of chronic alcohol consumption patterns consistent with controlled intoxication rather than random binge drinking. The theory suggests that berserkers used alcohol as a performance-enhancing drug, consuming specific amounts before battle to achieve an optimal state of fearless aggression while maintaining enough motor control to be effective fighters. This wasn't mindless drinking, it was precision dosing for maximum combat effectiveness. The most chilling aspect of Viking alcohol warfare was its use in diplomatic settings. Enemy leaders would be invited to peace negotiations or alliance discussions, only to find themselves facing strategically intoxicated Vikings who had calculated their own alcohol intake to maintain sharp thinking while their opponents became increasingly impaired. One documented case involves the treaty negotiations between King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark and Emperor Otto I of Germany in 974 AD. Viking accounts suggest that Harald's negotiators consumed a mild ale mixed with stimulating herbs before the meetings, while ensuring their German counterparts were served much stronger wine. The result was a treaty heavily favored toward the Vikings, with German concessions that sober negotiators would never have agreed to. By the time the German delegates realized they'd been outmaneuvered, they were bound by agreements made while intoxicated, and backing out would have meant war. The Vikings also developed techniques for building alcohol tolerance that gave them significant advantages in diplomatic and social situations. Young warriors were trained to consume increasing amounts of alcohol while performing complex tasks, building both tolerance and the ability to function while intoxicated. This training created a class of Vikings who could drink foreign diplomats, traders, and rivals under the table while maintaining their own mental sharpness. In a culture where important business was often conducted over drinks, this was a massive strategic advantage. The most sophisticated form of alcohol warfare involved what historians now call the poisoned feast. Vikings would invite enemy leaders to elaborate banquets, serving different types and strengths of alcohol to different guests based on careful calculation of their tolerance, political importance, and potential threat level. Allies and neutral parties would receive mild ale or diluted wine. Minor enemies might get stronger drinks that would loosen their tongues and reveal useful information. Major threats would be served alcohol so potent that they'd be incapacitated for days, allowing the Vikings to execute other plans without interference. Archaeological evidence from a 9th century longhouse in Norway reveals storage areas containing dozens of different types of alcoholic beverages, each with different alcohol contents and additives. The sophistication of this system suggests that alcohol warfare was a developed science rather than crude improvisation. The psychological impact of these tactics extended far beyond individual battles or negotiations. The Vikings' reputation for being able to drink anyone under the table became a form of psychological intimidation in itself. Enemy leaders often approached diplomatic encounters already psychologically defeated, knowing they were unlikely to match Viking alcohol tolerance. But the Vikings' relationship with extreme drinking went beyond warfare and politics. Their legendary excesses reveal a culture that understood the fine line between celebration and self-destruction, and sometimes chose to cross it anyway. The stories I'm about to tell you sound like fiction, but they're documented historical accounts that reveal just how far Viking drinking culture could push the boundaries of human endurance. These weren't just parties that got out of hand, they were legendary displays of excess that lasted for weeks and sometimes ended in death. The most documented case of Viking drinking excess comes from the winter feast of 987 AD at the Hall of Jarl Sigvaldi in Denmark. What started as a celebration of a successful raiding season turned into a month-long drinking marathon that killed 3 participants and left the Jarl himself permanently impaired. Historical accounts describe a feast where participants took turns drinking from increasingly larger vessels, with each round requiring the drinker to consume more alcohol than the previous person. The competition aspect transformed what should have been a celebration into a deadly game of one-upmanship. The rules were simple but brutal. If you couldn't match the previous drinker's consumption, you were considered a coward and lost social standing. If you tried to match it and passed out, you were mocked and excluded from future feasts. The only way to maintain respect was to drink more than anyone else, regardless of the physical consequences. By the second week, participants were consuming quantities of alcohol that modern medical science would consider lethal. The survivors' accounts describe hallucinations, violent seizures, and periods of unconsciousness lasting for days. 3 men died from what we now know was acute alcohol poisoning, but their deaths were celebrated as heroic rather than tragic. The most shocking aspect was the attitude toward these deaths. Rather than viewing them as casualties of excessive drinking, Viking culture treated them as warriors who died in a different kind of battle. They received the same funeral honors as soldiers killed in combat, complete with weapons buried alongside them for the afterlife. Eric the Red, the famous explorer who colonized Greenland, was notorious for his drinking excesses even by Viking standards. Historical accounts describe him as capable of consuming enough alcohol to incapacitate 3 normal men while remaining functional enough to make strategic decisions and lead complex expeditions. But Eric's drinking wasn't just about personal tolerance, it was a calculated display of dominance. By drinking his companions and rivals into unconsciousness while remaining alert and in control, he demonstrated a form of superiority that was as effective as physical combat in establishing leadership. One documented incident from Eric's time in Iceland describes a drinking contest that lasted for 4 consecutive days. Eric challenged 5 other prominent Vikings to match his consumption, with the understanding that whoever lasted longest would claim disputed territory rights. By the end of the 4th day, Eric was the only participant still conscious, and he gained control of valuable farmland without drawing a sword. The psychological warfare involved in these drinking contests was extraordinary. Participants had to balance the desire to prove their strength against the very real risk of death or permanent injury. The pressure to continue drinking, even when experiencing obvious signs of alcohol poisoning, was immense. Archaeological evidence from Eric's settlement in Greenland reveals brewing and distillation equipment far more advanced than what was typical for Viking colonies. This suggests that maintaining his reputation for excessive drinking required significant resources and technological innovation, even in one of the world's most remote locations. The most disturbing accounts come from the winter celebrations known as Jol, which could last for up to 12 days. These weren't casual holiday parties, they were endurance tests where participants were expected to maintain high levels of intoxication for nearly 2 weeks straight. Historical records describe Jol celebrations where participants consumed so much alcohol that they lost entire days to blackouts, yet were expected to continue drinking when they regained consciousness. The social pressure to participate fully in these celebrations was so intense that some Vikings reportedly went into debt purchasing enough alcohol to last the entire period. The health consequences were predictably severe. Skeletal remains from known Viking settlements show evidence of liver damage, brain injury, and other conditions consistent with chronic severe alcohol abuse. Yet these physical costs were apparently considered acceptable trade-offs for social status and cultural participation. One of the most extreme documented cases involves a celebration at the court of King Olaf Tryggvason in Norway around 995 AD. The king, known for his own prodigious drinking ability, challenged his entire court to a consumption contest that lasted for 21 days. By the end, only the king and 3 of his closest advisors were still capable of standing. The political implications were significant. The king's demonstration of superior alcohol tolerance reinforced his authority more effectively than any military victory could have. Those who had failed the drinking challenge found their political influence severely diminished, while those who had lasted longest gained increased power and responsibility. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of Viking drinking excess was its integration with religious and spiritual practices. What modern culture might view as alcoholism was often considered a form of divine communication, with extreme intoxication seen as a pathway to spiritual enlightenment and prophetic visions. The connection between alcohol and the divine in Viking culture went far beyond simple ritual consumption. The technology and techniques they developed for producing alcohol were as sophisticated as their weapons and ships and far more influential on daily life. The Vikings weren't just accomplished warriors and explorers, they were also master chemists and engineers whose innovations in alcohol production were centuries ahead of their time. What I'm about to reveal will completely change how you think about Viking technological sophistication. Recent archaeological discoveries have uncovered Viking brewing operations that rival modern microbreweries in complexity and efficiency. We're talking about temperature-controlled fermentation systems, multi-stage distillation processes, and quality control methods that wouldn't look out of place in a contemporary craft brewery. The most remarkable discovery comes from a 10th century settlement in Iceland, where archaeologists found what can only be described as an ancient industrial brewery. The facility included temperature-controlled fermentation chambers built into the ground, sophisticated filtration systems using sand and charcoal, and storage vessels designed to maintain specific alcohol content levels over extended periods. The engineering involved was extraordinary. The Vikings had figured out how to maintain consistent temperatures for fermentation by using geothermal springs and carefully designed air circulation systems. They understood that temperature control was crucial for producing consistent, high-quality alcohol, and they developed solutions that modern brewers would recognize and respect. But the real breakthrough was their approach to yeast cultivation. Long before anyone understood the science of fermentation, the Vikings had developed methods for preserving and propagating specific yeast strains that produced desired flavors and alcohol content levels. They accomplished this by maintaining starter cultures in special clay vessels that were never completely emptied. Each new batch of ale or mead would be started using remnants from the previous batch, ensuring consistency and gradually improving the flavor profile over generations. Some of these yeast cultures were apparently maintained for decades, passed down through families like precious heirlooms. The sophistication of their ingredient sourcing was equally impressive. Vikings established trade networks specifically to obtain exotic flavoring agents and fermentation additives from across Europe and beyond. Archaeological evidence shows Vikings importing honey from as far south as Greece, hops from Germany, and various herbs and spices from regions spanning from Ireland to Constantinople. This wasn't random ingredient gathering, it was strategic sourcing designed to create specific types of alcoholic beverages for different purposes. Light ales for daily consumption, stronger beverages for ceremonies, and specialized drinks with added herbs for medicinal or psychological effects. The most shocking discovery involves what can only be called prehistoric chemical engineering. Vikings had learned to concentrate alcohol content through partial freezing, a technique that wouldn't be formally documented by European scientists for another 400 years. By allowing their beverages to partially freeze and then removing the ice, they could increase alcohol content dramatically. Archaeological evidence suggests they could achieve alcohol concentrations of 30 to 40%, turning regular ale into something approaching modern distilled spirits. They also developed techniques for flavoring and preserving alcohol that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of chemistry. By adding specific combinations of herbs, fruits, and even tree barks, they could create beverages that remained stable for months without refrigeration, while developing complex flavors that changed over time. One of the most ingenious innovations was their development of portable brewing systems for long sea voyages. Vikings figured out how to continue fermenting alcohol aboard their ships, ensuring fresh alcoholic beverages even during expeditions lasting months. The shipboard brewing systems were marvels of compact engineering. They included fermentation vessels designed to remain stable in rough seas, airtight storage containers that prevented contamination, and even methods for using seawater as a source of minerals that enhanced fermentation. But perhaps their most impressive technological achievement was the development of what historians now call tactical alcohol, beverages specifically designed for different combat and social situations. They created fast-acting drinks that could provide quick courage boosts before battle, long-lasting beverages that maintained mild intoxication over extended periods, and specialized mixtures designed to enhance specific physical or mental capabilities. Archaeological analysis of drinking vessels from different contexts, battlefield sites, diplomatic locations, religious ceremonies, shows that Vikings were using different types of alcohol for different purposes, with each type carefully engineered for its intended use. The famous drinking horns weren't just ceremonial objects, they were precision instruments designed to deliver specific amounts of alcohol. Different horn sizes corresponded to different social situations and alcohol tolerances, allowing hosts to control exactly how intoxicated their guests became. Recent analysis of preserved drinking horns reveals that many contained internal markings that served as measuring devices, allowing users to consume precise amounts of alcohol based on their body weight, tolerance level, and intended level of intoxication. The most sophisticated horns contain multiple chambers that could hold different types of alcohol simultaneously, allowing the user to customize their drinking experience by adjusting the mixture ratio as they consume the contents. This level of technological sophistication in alcohol production and consumption reveals a culture that understood the strategic importance of controlled intoxication far better than most people realize. The Vikings weren't just good at drinking, they were master engineers of intoxication who developed techniques and technologies that influenced alcohol production for centuries. Their innovations in brewing, distillation, and alcohol delivery systems represent one of the most underappreciated technological achievements of the medieval period. These weren't primitive people making crude drinks, they were sophisticated engineers who happened to focus their talents on perfecting the art and science of getting wasted. But the true legacy of Viking drinking culture extends far beyond their technological innovations. The influence of their attitudes and practices toward alcohol can be traced through modern culture in ways that most people never realize. As we reach the end of this journey through the intoxicating world of Viking drinking culture, let's take a moment to absorb the most shocking revelations we've uncovered. The Vikings weren't just warriors who happened to drink heavily, they were sophisticated engineers of intoxication who understood the strategic, social, and survival applications of alcohol better than any culture before or since. We've discovered that Viking children grew up on a constant, mild alcoholic buzz because it was literally safer than drinking water. We've learned that mead, the supposed drink of choice for all Vikings, was actually so rare and expensive that most Vikings never tasted genuine mead in their entire lives, leading to an underground economy of sophisticated mead forgeries. We've uncovered the secret world of Sumbl ceremonies, where alcohol-fueled rituals could topple kingdoms and reshape political landscapes, with women wielding surprising power in these sacred drinking rites. We've explored how Vikings turned alcohol into a weapon of warfare, using strategic intoxication to outmaneuver enemies in both battle and diplomacy. We've witnessed legendary excesses that killed participants, and seen how Vikings developed technology for alcohol production that was centuries ahead of its time, creating everything from temperature-controlled brewing systems to tactical beverages designed for specific combat situations. But perhaps the most profound revelation is how deeply Viking drinking culture has influenced our modern world. The concept of drinking someone under the table as a display of dominance. That comes directly from Viking culture. The idea that important business should be conducted over drinks, pure Viking tradition. Even our modern craft brewing movement, with its emphasis on specialized ingredients and precise fermentation control, is following paths first blazed by Viking brewmasters over 1,000 years ago. The Norse concept of using alcohol as a social lubricant for difficult conversations, a tool for building trust between potential enemies, and a method for revealing true intentions has become so embedded in modern culture that we barely recognize its origins. Think about modern corporate culture, where deals are made over drinks, where liquid lunches remain a standard business practice, and where someone's ability to handle alcohol is still seen as a measure of their reliability and strength. These practices trace directly back to Viking traditions that treated alcohol tolerance as a form of political and social currency. Even our legal systems have been influenced by Viking drinking culture. The concept that statements made while intoxicated can still be legally binding, the idea that alcohol can be used as evidence of someone's true character, and the notion that excessive drinking might indicate leadership potential rather than personal weakness. These concepts all have roots in Viking legal and social traditions. The psychological warfare aspects of Viking drinking culture persist in modern business and politics. The practice of getting opponents drunk during negotiations, the strategic use of alcohol to lower inhibitions and extract information, and the concept of drinking contests as displays of dominance are all alive and well in contemporary power structures. But there's a darker legacy as well. The Viking normalization of extreme drinking, their celebration of alcohol-related deaths as heroic rather than tragic, and their integration of dangerous drinking practices into religious and social obligations have contributed to cultural attitudes toward alcohol that persist today. The romantic mythology surrounding Viking drinking culture has obscured its more troubling aspects. The use of alcohol as a tool of manipulation and control, the pressure to consume dangerous quantities to maintain social standing, and the weaponization of intoxication for political and military advantage. As you go forward from this story, I want you to consider how much of what you think you know about alcohol in your own culture might be inherited from Viking traditions you never realized existed. The next time you're at a business dinner where drinks flow freely, or watching politicians make statements they'll later regret, or witnessing someone trying to prove their worth through alcohol consumption, remember that you're watching the echo of Viking drinking culture reverberating through time. The Vikings understood something that modern society is still grappling with. Alcohol is never just about the drink itself. It's about power, survival, social control, spiritual experience, and the complex ways that altered consciousness intersects with human ambition and fear. Their legacy reminds us that every culture's relationship with alcohol reveals deeper truths about their values, fears, and aspirations. The Vikings chose to embrace alcohol as a central organizing principle of their society, with all the benefits and consequences that entailed. Perhaps the most important lesson from Viking drinking culture is this: the substances we choose to celebrate, the rituals we build around them, and the myths we tell about them reveal who we really are as a people. The Vikings got absolutely wasted, but they did so with intention, strategy, and a level of cultural sophistication that challenges everything we thought we knew about both alcohol and medieval civilization. What does your relationship with alcohol say about you? And more importantly, what would a future historian conclude about our culture based on how we choose to get wasted? That's a question worth pondering, preferably with a drink in hand, but maybe not too strong of one. After all, we've learned today that the Vikings who survived longest were those who understood the difference between strategic intoxication and reckless excess. If this journey through the hidden world of Viking drinking culture has opened your eyes to new possibilities for understanding history, make sure you're subscribed for more deep dives into the shocking truths that textbooks never taught you. Until next time, remember, history is always more complex, more fascinating, and more relevant to your modern life than anyone wants you to believe. The Vikings knew this, now you do too.